By January of 1776, the Continental Army outside Boston was buoyed by the arrival of 58 pieces of artillery brought by Henry Knox from Ticonderoga. But the arrival of the guns was not enough in itself to seal the fate of the British garrison inside Boston. It took almost 2 months for General William Howe's redcoats to leave the city, during which time General Washington had to be talked down from some of his more ambitious plans, and further American ingenuity brought to bear to capitalize on Knox's prize. The American siege of Boston had dragged on for 9 months. Knox returned with needed artillery and the reward of a colonel's commission, but recruiting had slowed and the Continentals were still desperately short of one key commodity: gunpowder. Boston Harbor froze by early February, providing Washington with an interesting possibility: storming the city across the ice. This would avoid the need for a bombardment that would require extensive stocks of powder. However, at a council of war held on February 16th, 7 generals, including Israel Putnam, John Sullivan, John Thomas, and Horatio Gates, almost unanimously rejected the idea. They argued that any attack would be too costly, given British preparations, and if by chance they failed, their situation would become even worse. Unable to convince his generals, and fearing a bombardment of Boston with what stores of powder they possessed might destroy the city to little effect, a new plan started to take shape. Why not lure the British out of the city and destroy them on the Continentals' terms? 6 days before the Council of War, Washington, Knox, and other officers had surveyed the causeway to Dorchester Heights, the last unfortified high ground surrounding Boston. Already, at the general's request, Lieutenant Colonel Rufus Putnam had assessed what it would take to fortify this position. At the time, Washington was still not convinced. Older than Knox, Putnam had served under British engineers at Ticonderoga in the French and Indian War. But despite this experience, he had no formal military training that, like Knox, he made up for with energy and creativity. His key assessment was that the cold that had frozen the harbor had also frozen the ground, which would prevent digging to any depth as they had done at Bunker Hill the previous year. To erect lines that could overlook Boston, mounted with Knox's guns, would require building fortifications above ground, meaning hauling materials to Dorchester. The Continentals accepted this challenge as the cost of drawing the British out. A post on Dorchester, mounted with Knox's guns, would be a threat the redcoats could not ignore. Drawing them into the trap would ensure the Americans could maximize their limited resources and training by their proven ability to fight behind defensive works. Across the lines, the army went into action. New batteries were completed for a bombardment to divert the British. Artillery cartridges were filled from stockpiled powder and shot and shells from New York, while carriages were manufactured in Framingham to mount Knox's guns to bring them into action. Soldiers across the army cut turf, worked boards, felled trees, built fascines and wooden chandeliers, and prepared barrels for the planned defenses on Dorchester Heights, which were slated to be taken on March 4th. 2 nights before, cannon and mortars, including some from Ticonderoga, opened fire from the Continental lines surrounding Boston. This continued the following night despite accidentally bursting a few of their mortars. The British dutifully returned fire, a crescendo of destruction that drew attention away from the seizure of Dorchester Heights. Over 2,000 Continentals, under the command of Brigadier General John Thomas of Massachusetts, marched under cover to summit Dorchester Heights and erect the clever defenses devised by Putnam. Hundreds of teams of oxen hauled the pre-made supplies, and the following morning, the British were shocked at the extent of the American works. They immediately responded. Troops in Boston were mobilized, as Washington had hoped, to storm the American positions, and the Continentals could see the British preparing to embark for the assault on Dorchester. But a storm blew up that prevented the British from crossing the harbor and making good on their counterattack. This was the last straw. In fact, for weeks, the British position had grown tenuous. The city was crowded, supplies were running low, and they had already loaded up some of their heavy guns and prepared ships for an eventual departure. The capture of Dorchester Heights tipped the scales, and following their failed sortie, General William Howe prepared to evacuate the city. Over the succeeding days, the Continentals continued to expand their lines on Dorchester Heights, building cannon and mortar batteries for Knox's guns, and eventually opening fire to speed the British withdrawal. The selectmen of Boston tried to negotiate an agreement that the British would preserve the town if Washington's gunners left them alone. The last British troops left Boston on March 17, 1776, forever remembered in the city not only as St. Patrick's Day, but as Evacuation Day. But no sooner had Boston fallen than the Continental Army began to redeploy to face different threats. And just 2 days after leading the detachment onto Dorchester Heights, Congress promoted General Thomas to take command of the army in Canada, where that invasion teetered on the brink of collapse.